Welcome to Word to Action at Home. Word to Action is a Bible course we usually run at Willowfield. The aim of this course is to go deeper into God's Word, wrestling with how to apply biblical teaching in a practical, everyday way. The main purpose of the course is to help equip us in our devotions and Bible study at home, looking at how to engage with the passage or story or truth of this ancient book in a very relevant way. I hope you will find these recordings helpful and practical. I hope it will whet your appetite and encourage you to read and study and wrestle with this wonderful book. But most of all, I hope it will encourage you to see that you can do what I do, that you can take a passage and with some patience, with some hard work and with some practical tools, you can bring the Bible to life in a spirit-filled, life-giving, transformative way. So whoever you are, whatever your Bible knowledge, even if you've never read the Bible before, I'm glad that you're joining me for these studies. Be blessed.
Hey, so welcome to Word to Action. Thank you so much for joining with me. Hope you're keeping well. This week we're going to be in Esther Chapter 6. I'd love you to grab your Bible, turn to Chapter 6, and let's work it through together. I'm going to flick screens here and show you how I work through this passage using that technique from the very first week.
Okay, Esther chapter 6. Let's work through the cast in this chapter. So again, taking the colour blue, and let's just highlight who we find. We'll look at verse 1. You see the king. That's obviously King Xerxes. He has an attendant as well. We also are introduced to Mordecai in verse 2. And then you remember all the way back in chapter 2, you had Bithynia and Teresh, those two eunuchs who were on guard outside the king's private quarters. Jump down to verse 4 and we find Haman. And then finally down in verse 13 we have Zeresh, that's Haman's wife, all his friends and his wise advisors. And the very last character we see at the very last verse, verse 14, is Queen Esther. Okay, now that we have the cast, let's work through this together. So the king, one particular night, had trouble sleeping. He orders his attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign. And in that book he discovers an account. And the account that he discovers is that of Mordecai, who exposed the plot to assassinate King Xerxes. Now the king at this point remembers or recalls that event which happened a number of years earlier. And he asks in verse 3, what reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? His attendant replies, nothing. And that's our first problem there. The problem is that someone hasn't been rewarded, and that's a bad look for the king. If you're a king that cares what others think of you, and someone so generously saved your life but you did not reward him, that is not a good look. So that's the first problem. The second problem is actually in verse 4. It's a little bit subtle here, but whenever King Xerxes asks who is in the outer court, he's not simply asking who is in the outer court. He's asking who is in court, who can help me here. He needs to make a decision. He needs to lead, but he's not quite sure what to do. Again, that has been an MO of Xerxes all the way through this book. He is a king with all this power, but is a king who cannot lead, is unable to lead for himself. So we find out that Haman just happened to be outside, and he is coming to the king, not necessarily to help the king in this circumstance, but he is coming to the king to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole that he has been up all night building, remember, at the end of chapter 5. Now what happens next in verse 6 here is that Haman is now distracted. You see that? He's distracted by this question that Xerxes asks. What should I do to honour a man who truly pleases me? And look what happens next. Haman thought to himself. That's really important in this chapter. Haman thought to himself. He reasoned with himself. He figures that this entire chapter, this entire story, and possibly this entire book is all about Haman. So he's come, here's the important bit, he's come in verse 4 to get revenge. He's been distracted, and then as we end there in verse 9, we see this elaborate reward. So we jump from revenge to reward in this chapter. The king thinks this is a great idea. Look at verse 10. Excellent, the king said to Haman, quick, take my robes and horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew. Leave out nothing you have suggested. So it is Mordecai who is honoured in this chapter. And look how Haman ends in this chapter. Look at verse 12. Haman hurried home dejected and completely humiliated. Here. So we've jumped from revenge in verse 4 to reward in verses 8 to 9. And then finally, we see this reversals. Remember, that is a big theme. That theme of reversals is such a massive theme throughout this book. The chapter ends in verse 13 with Haman's wife saying, "This man has humiliated you. You will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue to oppose him." Basically, what Zeresh has announced here is the defeat of Haman. This is game over for Haman. And I guess it leaves the question, if the game is over for Haman, well, what about Esther? There she is at the end of that chapter. What about her next move? There is another important little phrase that's used in this chapter that helps us to understand what is going on here. If you jump up to verse 4 and look at what it says there, as it happened. That's important because this is a whole chapter basically of it just happened. It just happened that one night the king couldn't sleep. It just happened that he couldn't figure out what to do with a reward. It just happened that Haman was walking past. It just happened that Haman thought the whole chapter was all about him. And so that theme continues the whole way through it. The reason I'm lifting that out, because at this point in our chapter, and at this point in our book, we get to see a very clear indication of who is at work behind the scenes. And obviously, we know God is at work in this chapter.
Okay, now that we've worked our way through that passage and highlighted some things and brought some things to our attention, it's time now to chop it up into some bite-sized chunks. I want to take chapter 6, split it into 3, verses 1 and 2, simply the king who can't sleep. Then looking at verses 3 to 6, the king who can't lead. And then finally, verses 7 to 14, the prime minister who can't win. If you've listened to the preach on this, and I encourage you to do that, go back to willowfieldchurch.online and listen to it, or if you've read through the chapter for yourself, I love this quote from Jobs. He says, "This is one of the most ironically comic scenes in the entire Bible." Like, it is one of those beautiful scenes that is actually laugh out loud funny if you think about it here. It is basically a chapter where Haman thinks it's all about me. That's very obvious from very early on. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a conversation with someone before and you've simply got your wires crossed. You think they're talking about something and they are in fact talking about something completely different. Then all of a sudden there's this light bulb moment where you realize, hey, we're both talking about completely the wrong thing here. And there's this kind of awkwardness that comes up, and you make an awkward excuse to get away, and you walk away rather awkwardly embarrassed. Your face turns red when you think about, I cannot believe that I thought he was talking or she was talking about something else and I got it completely wrong. I wonder, would you be brave enough to admit a story like that out loud? I'm definitely not going to do it on this recording where the whole world can see it. But we all have had those stories where we just get our wires crossed and it's a little bit awkward. We come home, we cringe, and we just replay that story over and over in our head, hoping to avoid that person the next day or for some days to come. Well, chapter 6 is one of those cringy stories. It is actually painful to watch what unfolds in this chapter as Haman thinks the story is all about him. But it's only painful to watch because we as a reader get this inside track that he doesn't get. We know it's obvious that the king is talking about someone else, but Haman's not supposed to know that. So here's the awkwardness. It starts in verse 6. Mr. Center of his own world thinks this entire episode is all about Haman. And you kind of feel sorry for Haman at this point. Like, you almost want to reach into the story and say, look, Haman, this story is not about you. Just let it go. Not everything has to revolve around you, Haman. But then I kind of think, even if we could do that, even if that was a possibility in our story, I still think Haman would have ignored that advice. I still think Haman would remain confident that the story is about him. Because you have to remember, this is the second most powerful man in the world. He is used to people bowing down. When Haman walks into a room, or when Haman walks onto a street, or when he passed you by, it was the law that you had to bow down to him. So Haman is used to that posture. He's used to being higher up than everyone else, and everyone else bowing down before him. You get used to that pride and power and authority and control and position in this story. Here's the irony. I love this from Deborah Reed. The irony in this chapter is multi-dimensional and multi-purpose. The scene with which the episode ends is farcical, but also acutely symbolic of a deeper reality. It marks the beginning of a series of reversals in favor of the Jews by empowering their representative Mordecai and humiliating their enemy Haman. The ironies rely on misunderstanding and confusion. Haman is humiliated, though the king never intended that. And Mordecai is raised to royal status, though the king never really intended that either. The incident is highly illustrative of the age-old adage that pride comes before a fall. We're back to this theme. I know we repeat this a lot, but it's so important to understand what is going on in Esther. This is a book that is about the powerful versus the powerless, the important versus the unimportant, those who have a voice and are really dominating, strong voice, and those who seemingly have no voice. But in this power, because we're supposed to be presented with it from beginning of chapter 1, this Persian Empire, King Xerxes and Haman are supposed to be the really strong characters in our story. And we're supposed to be intimidated by their power. We're supposed to be afraid of their power. But you can see there's cracks developing in this story. There's elements of satire scattered throughout this chapter, but also throughout the kingdom as well. We've looked at those in previous weeks as well. This is a kingdom, and Haman is a person who always wants to present himself and that kingdom as powerful. But what actually happens in this little chapter, in chapter 6, is that he's presented and appears as an absolute fool. Chapter 6 is a chapter where God moves in the most supernatural of ways, but also in the most hidden, silent, and natural of ways. And we see that God is directing this episode. Again, think of the power. Think of who is supposed to be in control. Haman thinks he's the one with all the power and all the control here. But it is in fact God who remains hidden in this chapter. But if you dig a little deeper, you can see who is in control. Think about the chapter. Think about the series of events that go on in this chapter. Like it just happened that King Xerxes couldn't sleep one particular night. It just happened that out of all the stories that he had an attendant read to him, they just happened to come across the story of Mordecai who foils that plot of an assassination against the king. It just happens that King Xerxes cares about saving face. And he realizes he hasn't rewarded Mordecai, and he realizes that to save face, something must be done. It just happened that King Xerxes cannot make a decision for himself and has been rubbish at leading throughout this entire book. And it just happened that Haman is the one who walks past on this particular day, and he is the one that Xerxes asks for advice. It just happens that Haman thinks the story is completely about him, and he's making these grand, over-the-top, elaborate suggestions as to what the reward might be, which he thinks is for himself. Just so happens he thinks the story is all about himself. And it just so happens that this elaborate revenge plot that was birthed in the previous chapter turns into this elaborate reward for Mordecai. What a difference 2 days makes. Remember we said last time that this is a book, this is a story that moves from chapters 1 to 4 that cover 9 years. And then all of a sudden we come to chapter 5 right through to the end, and all of a sudden it slows down. The pace slows way, way down, and it's just 48 little hours. And it slows down. And in the slowing down of that, it makes us stop. And it makes us look around the story, and we actually see who is in control. Here's the thing, from chapter 4, the end of chapter 4, and immediately as we come into chapter 5, we are in a panic that Esther do something, that she does something more than just host some banquets. We are in a panic that she does some bold move where she goes quickly to the king and asks him to reverse that evil decree that Haman started in chapter 3. We are in a hurry for this story to stop, for Haman to be removed, for him to get his comeuppance. We are in a hurry, we are frustrated, and we want this story to be resolved. And we are frustrated at Esther's stalling and her delays and her detours along the way. But here's the thing, while we're in a rush, God is not in a rush, and He is not in a panic, and He is at work. So while the pace might seem to have slowed way down, God is at work in this chapter. God is moving, God is doing, and God is working. I love this quote by A.W. Tozer. God moves undisturbed and unhindered towards the fulfillment of His eternal purposes. I want us to think about who is in control of our life. What has this season taught you about life? Who is in control? Sometimes in the midst of what we have suffered in these last few weeks, we've realized that we are really not in control. We like to be in control, we try to be in control, but we're not in control. And sometimes when life spins wildly out of control and when things start to slow down, it's wise for us to pause and reflect and see what is happening. Maybe we need to slow down. Maybe we need to stop. Maybe we need to be still and know that God is God over our life, over the good days, over the bad days, over the trying days, but also over the days that just seem to breeze right through. We need to know that God is in control. So my encouragement to myself and my encouragement to you tonight is, why not take some time? And we've had ample opportunity in these last, 13 weeks? We've had ample opportunity just to hit pause, listen to God. But sometimes in the busyness and sometimes in the panic to make things happen and the frustration to get over the line and get out of this lockdown or this pandemic, sometimes we're distracted and we're listening to all kinds of other competing voices. This is a story that goes from this really fast 4 chapters of 9 years that slows down, and we get to see that God is all over this chapter. God is all over this book, and again, He is all over your life. I'd love to encourage you to do that over these coming days and over these coming weeks. I hope you're blessed by these studies. This is Esther Chapter 6, Finding Hope When God Seems Hidden. Look forward to seeing you next week. Be blessed.